You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to turn to what's been happening over in the Middle East, an inflammation of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, particularly between Israel and Hamas, which is the de facto governing authority, if you can call it that, of Gaza. And the interesting dynamic that's taking place here has been so woefully misrepresented by the media. Yes, you've got rockets and missiles that are going back and forth between Gaza and Israel, between Hamas and Israel, but the effect it's having on civilians has been misrepresented, the chronology has been misrepresented, and even the tension that actually triggered this has been misrepresented, a dispute that goes back to a specific area of Jerusalem and Palestinian families being evicted. But I want to talk about this in great detail because, again, the facts are important and are not being told in the mainstream media coverage, which is why Mike Fegelman of HonestReporting Canada does what he does. He goes through, and if you look at his website, you can see point by point, anytime the media passes off a falsehood as truth or makes even an honest mistake that has significant implications, he's there to record it and to actually get it corrected, and has a fair bit of success with this in the past as well. Mike Fegelman, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure. Good to be with you, Andrew.
So I want to start with, because this is so complicated, and people like you who immerse yourself in this have a background knowledge that a lot of Canadians might not have looking at this. If we bring this most recent bout of tension and conflict back, it seems to be something that most people are triggering back to what has itself been misrepresented, which is this eviction of Palestinian families from their home. And I want to play a brief clip here, if I may, of a radio report that aired on CBC Radio.
A spokesman for Hamas in Beirut, Osama Hamdan, isn't making any promises about how long they will continue, but he sounded just as defiant, blaming Israel for weeks of clashes in Jerusalem, where Israelis are trying to evict Palestinian homeowners, and where Palestinians and Israeli police have clashed at the city's holiest shrine, Al-Aqsa.
So that reporter, Sasha Petrikich, says that there are Israelis trying to evict Palestinian homeowners. This is not, though, as you point out, accurate.
Well, it's not. And quite frankly, what the Palestinians are doing, Hamas and Palestinian Authority, they're exploiting what is traditionally a real estate dispute, something between tenants and landowners, into a nationalistic claim with a fervor to incite the masses to convict violence. The issue is simply that the Palestinians who are living in these homes are living there rent-free and are squatting and not paying rent to the Jewish owners. And, Israel, it's a democracy, and it's an issue that's being dealt with and adjudicated in the Israeli courts, Supreme Court, mind you. The Israeli government's not taking a position. This is for the judiciary. And yet this issue is being used as a pretext, a whipping tool, really, to foment a discord between Israelis and Palestinians of the likes that we're seeing play out in the streets of Jerusalem. And as you see with 2,000 rockets that have been fired on Israeli cities like Ashkelon and Sderot.
Yeah, and the shameful part of this is that you are very correct to point out that there are people that want to turn this into something different than what it is, who want to misrepresent the facts and who want to stoke this. But a lot of people in the media are buying into it. And I have to ask, is this just because of ignorance in a lot of ways? They don't know this, or is it because there is a more, if I can use the word, a more insidious bias that's taking place where they just want to view that Israeli dynamic through that lens?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination. I'll draw back to the report by Sasha Petrusik. Do I think that he has an axe to grind against Israel? Not necessarily, but I do think that he got the facts wrong, because the Palestinians were not homeowners. They were just living in a rental establishment. Andrew, if you rent your apartment and you don't pay it, you're going to have to deal with the legal process. The next step is not to throw rocks and shoot people and lob rockets at Israelis. But there are, it's a case by case basis, but there certainly are journalists who have inclinations where they have certain partisan favoritism of certain issues, and their opinion sometimes gets disguised as news. It can be subtle, and other times it can be really quite obvious. I mean, a report that we flagged this morning, a CBC journalist, a freelancer, had claimed that Gaza is an open-air prison. That's highly inflammatory language for a supposed neutral and objective journalist to use. But therein, you see, representatives from Canada's public broadcaster, our tax dollars, who are using that kind of incendiary language, and it's just not objective. And essentially, what we do at Honest Reporting, we're not trying to impart and just tell the media that they have to report in a certain way. We just want them to get the facts straight and to give Israel a fair shake, but we're not seeing it.
Yeah, and open air prison. I mean, I've heard that term before. It's frequently used by people who are quite anti-Israel, whatever the motivation of this particular journalist that CBC tapped for this segment was. But it's a values judgment. There's no way about it. It is a value judgment. It is an argumentation point that people could debate, but it's not a neutral point. It's not a fact-based point. I saw another news report, not from Canada, that kind of nonchalantly referred to Israel as occupying Gaza, which as well is not true. Someone would hear that, though, and that inherently frames the way they listen to and consume coverage. And for a region that has so much history, I mean, I've been to Israel twice. I've studied this extensively. It's a part of the world that I'm very passionate about. And even I wouldn't proclaim to be an expert on all of these details and nuances. And whenever I've written about Israel, I'm very nervous of accidentally using the wrong word or stumbling into some sort of a landmine. And people are going to make mistakes. I get it. They need to be corrected. You've been flagging these. Has there been, in this particular case, any response from CBC that's saying, yeah, you know what, you raise a good point there, Mike?
So what I'm happy to say is we have a very good dialogue with the CBC. We speak to their teams, various teams, different leverage points of the CBC very regularly. In some media, there's a feeling that they're immune to criticism. In some levels of the CBC that exists. But I think that the CBC is cognizant that mistakes are being made. I'd like to think that they are taking remedial action. It doesn't always happen. You're right to point out that covering the Arab-Israeli conflict is probably the most complicated, difficult assignment for a journalist to do. The lexicon of the Middle East is a ticking time bomb. You refer to people making claims that Israel's occupying Gaza, though it doesn't, and it disengaged in 2005, and Israel pulled out its armed forces, just removed all 21 settlements, 8,500 settlers. And what did it get? It got a forward launching base by an Iran proxy shooting 2,000 rockets at it. And it's the issue mostly is that kind of context is stripped. When we talk about the rocket fire, we don't really consider how, you hear the media say these are homemade rockets. Well, the reality is these things are really going a great distance. They're lethal. And the real concern is not just with these kind of rockets that exist now, but what could happen in the future if Palestinian terrorists or Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon or elsewhere could get ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could really put Israel in paralysis. We saw last night there's incredible footage of planes trying to land at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, where you see the rockets being fired in and Israel's missile interceptor, the Iron Dome, trying to repel them back. And that's what these terrorists are really trying to do. On top of, ultimately committing the genocide of Jews and wiping Israel off the map, they're trying to paralyze Israel. Because what ends up happening is, and we had, I think, 3 or 4 different major airlines canceling flights to Israel, perhaps indefinitely until the hostilities stop. And that's what they're trying to do. It's another effort to put a stranglehold on Israel. So when you have different people who are, cavalierly advocating for weapons sales to be canceled on Israel, whether it's Canadian politicians or elsewhere, what they're actually doing is putting out a welcome mat for Israel to be on the continued receiving end of rockets. And I should add, if that kind of a policy took hold and other governments worldwide said, you know what, we shouldn't sell arms to Israel, that's welcoming Israel's destruction. And, naturally, Israel is doing everything in its power to safeguard its citizenry, and it has that responsibility. And it goes without saying that any civilian life that is lost is tragic. But the reality is Hamas is committing double war crimes. It's firing on civilians while hiding behind civilians. And that's the issue that the media are really missing out.
Well, that is so tremendously important, Mike, because we see the footage of, in the last few days, apartment buildings, for example, that have become very ravaged by Israeli responses to Hamas rockets. And what people don't realize is that Hamas literally uses civilians as human shields in this case. But in the media, these stories tend to get told as examples of just rampant and indiscriminate Israeli aggression. And one story that you flag as well, CBC National claiming that Palestinian rocket fire was, quote, in return, unquote, of Israeli airstrikes. Again, two words that very fundamentally change the dynamic of how people view the news.
Yeah, and what they actually did is they reversed the chronology of how these hostilities began. And, in the CBC's mind, and mind you, it was on CBC The National, which is its flagship program, and largely the source where a lot of people get information. Mm-hmm. The story and the narrative that was told was that Israel initiated the violence by shooting rockets, and the Palestinian terrorists like Hamas and Islamic Jihad merely responded. And that's just, it's morally obtuse, it's morally repugnant, and it's just flat out wrong. And it's my job to make sure that the media gets out the narrative correctly as it actually happened. And we encourage our members, we have about 50,000 subscribers, to complain directly to the media, to voice their concerns.
Yeah, and I'm glad you do that, because I do think there is the way you said about, two war crimes basically taking place is incredibly valid. Israel does what it can to minimize collateral damage, civilian casualties, where Hamas does what it can to increase them on both sides. And that's the particular evil here, is that, yes, they want to kill Jewish lives, but they also are completely fine killing their own citizens if it helps them in their PR battle against Israel. And I think it's incumbent on Western media to not go along with that.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll give you a particular example. Even a Palestinian human rights group reported, I believe yesterday or the day before, that 8 Palestinians, 2 children, were killed by errant Palestinian rockets. And what's interesting to note is that Israel speculates that about a third of the 2,000 rockets that have been fired at Israeli cities prematurely exploded or landed errantly within Gaza. So when you hear about the casualties within the Palestinian territories, within Gaza, which, mind you, are told by the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is an arm of the Hamas terror group. So you got to question the combatant and civilian casualty counts right there. You're not really hearing that, well, how many of these people were killed by Palestinian munitions? And, Israel suspects that about 30 of, I think, at this point, given, where we are right now, about 60 some odd Palestinians who've died, are actually terrorists. But you don't hear those numbers. You just hear the total number. And that really paints a misleading picture. That what's depicted is that Israel is, de facto and implicitly targeting innocents. And that's just not the case. They're with pinpoint precision targeting terrorists. And they're doing it in a way that minimizes civilian casualties, doing things like that are really untold, to warn your combatant that you're even going to carry out an attack. So they'll you mentioned the buildings that were destroyed, which, mind you, were Hamas terror infrastructure they were using. They warn them with cell phone calls, with text messages, leaflets, thousands of leaflets that are dropped, and then they use a technique called the roof knocking technique, where they drop miniature munitions with non-lethal munitions on the top of the roof to tell people, if they didn't heed their warnings, to get out of the area. There's no other army in the history of modern warfare who would ever do this. And that's why Israel can proudly say it's the most moral military in the world.
Very well said, and I appreciate all your work having to keep glued to the mainstream media day in, day out to call these things out. But it is important, because when facts are gone, you lose a whole bunch in the way of any ability of having an honest discussion. Mike Fegelman, Executive Director of Honest Reporting Canada. His great work is updated pretty much in real time these days, and that's at honestreporting.ca. Mike, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Andrew, thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.